Sarah Jenkins wasn't expecting anything special when she walked into Atlanta Memorial Hospital that Tuesday morning. The tall, dark-skinned woman adjusted her nurse's badge as she made her way to the rehabilitation wing. She was covering for her colleague Linda, who had called in sick. "Good morning, Sarah." Dr. Williams called out, "I have a new patient for you today. Marcus Thompson, room 205. He's scheduled for his first physical therapy evaluation." Sarah nodded, picking up the patient file. As she read through it, her heart felt heavy. Marcus Thompson, age 32, had suffered a severe spinal injury in a construction accident 2 years ago. The accident had left him paralyzed from the waist down. When she entered room 205, Sarah heard laughter. A man in a wheelchair was telling jokes to one of the cleaning staff, making them both chuckle. He turned his chair around when he heard her footsteps. "You must be the nurse practitioner," Marcus said, his warm brown eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "I'm Marcus, but my friends call me Mark." Sarah couldn't help but smile back. Most patients she met were understandably depressed or angry about their conditions, but Marcus seemed different. His positive energy filled the room. "I'm Sarah Jenkins," she replied, pulling up a chair to sit at his eye level. "I'll be handling your evaluation today." As Sarah went through the standard questions, she found herself drawn into easy conversation with Marcus. He told her about his life before the accident. He had been a construction site supervisor, known for his quick thinking and leadership skills. But instead of dwelling on what he had lost, he spoke excitedly about his new online business selling custom-designed wheelchair accessories. "You see these wheel guards?" He pointed to the colorful designs on his wheelchair. "I designed them myself. Kids love them, makes them see wheelchairs as less scary." Sarah was impressed. "That's really thoughtful of you," she said, making notes in his file. "How did you come up with the idea?" Marcus's expression softened. "My niece was afraid to come near me after the accident. She thought the wheelchair was scary. So I decorated it with her favorite cartoon characters. Next thing I knew, other parents at physical therapy were asking where I got them." As they moved on to the physical evaluation, Sarah noticed how Marcus maintained his sense of humor, even when struggling with certain movements. He joked about his lazy legs and called his wheelchair his luxury ride. "You know what's funny?" he said while Sarah checked his muscle responses. "People think being in a wheelchair means your life is over. But I've met more interesting people and found more purpose in these 2 years than I did in the 10 years before." Sarah found herself sharing stories from her own life too, about growing up in Atlanta with her strict but loving parents, about choosing nursing as a career despite her mother's wishes for her to become a doctor. Marcus listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that showed he was genuinely interested. The evaluation session, which usually took 45 minutes, stretched to over an hour. Sarah only realized this when Dr. Williams poked his head in to check on them. "Sorry to interrupt," he said with a knowing smile, "but Sarah, your next patient is waiting." Sarah felt her cheeks warm as she quickly gathered her things. "I'm so sorry, I lost track of time," she apologized to Marcus. "Time flies when you're having fun," Marcus grinned. Then, with a more serious expression, he asked, "Will you be handling my therapy sessions going forward?" "Actually, I'm just covering for Linda today," Sarah explained, feeling an unexpected twinge of disappointment. "She'll be back tomorrow." "That's a shame," Marcus said, still smiling but with a hint of sadness in his eyes. "You're easy to talk to, Sarah." As Sarah walked to her next patient's room, she couldn't stop thinking about Marcus's infectious laugh and positive outlook. She had met hundreds of patients over her 6 years as a nurse practitioner, but something about him was different. What Sarah didn't know then was that this chance meeting would change both their lives forever. She couldn't have guessed that the warm feeling in her chest was the beginning of a love story that would challenge everyone's expectations, including her own. The next day, when Sarah passed by room 205 out of habit, she saw Linda working with Marcus. He caught her eye and waved, his smile brightening the room just like it had the day before. Sarah waved back, trying to ignore the way her heart skipped a beat. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of their story. Would you like me to continue with part 2 in the same style? 2 weeks passed since Sarah and Marcus's first meeting. Sarah tried to focus on her other patients, but she found herself taking the long route past room 205 during her rounds. Sometimes she would catch glimpses of Marcus working hard in his therapy sessions, his face determined and focused. One rainy afternoon, Sarah was leaving the hospital when she spotted a familiar wheelchair near the bus stop. Marcus sat there, looking frustrated as he checked his phone. "Marcus, is everything okay?" she asked, walking over with her umbrella. He looked up, his face brightening despite his obvious frustration. "Oh, hey Sarah, yeah, just waiting for my ride. My brother was supposed to pick me up, but his car broke down. The accessible taxi service has a 2-hour wait." Sarah glanced at the darkening sky and the heavy rain. Before she could think twice, she heard herself saying, "I can give you a ride home." "Are you sure?" "I don't want to trouble you," Marcus hesitated. "It's no trouble at all," Sarah smiled. "My car's just in the parking lot." During the drive, they talked about everything and nothing. Marcus told her about growing up with 4 siblings, being the middle child who always tried to keep the peace. Sarah shared stories about her strict father, a church deacon who still called her every Sunday to make sure she attended service. "Turn left here," Marcus directed. "The building with the blue awning." As Sarah helped Marcus with his wheelchair, he said, "Would you like to come up for some coffee? I make a mean cup of joe. It's the least I can do to thank you." Sarah knew she should probably say no. Getting personally involved with patients, even former ones, was complicated. But something about Marcus made her want to break the rules. Inside Marcus's apartment, Sarah was surprised by how warm and inviting it felt. Photos of family covered the walls, and his furniture was arranged to make wheelchair navigation easy. The kitchen counter was lowered, and everything was within reach from his chair. "I had to make some adjustments," he explained, noticing her looking around. "But it works for me." While Marcus made coffee, Sarah spotted a beautiful painting of a sunset. "This is gorgeous," she said. "Thanks. I painted that last year," Marcus replied, wheeling over with their coffee. "It was part of my therapy, learning to do things differently after the accident." Sarah sat on the couch while Marcus positioned his wheelchair nearby. They talked for hours, losing track of time. Marcus told her about his dreams of expanding his wheelchair accessory business into a full line of adaptive fashion. Sarah shared her hopes of opening a community health clinic someday. "You know," Marcus said thoughtfully, "most people treat me differently after they learn about my disability. They either pity me or try too hard to prove they're comfortable around me. But you just treat me like Marcus." Sarah felt her heart flutter. "That's because that's who you are to me, just Marcus." Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither spoke. The air felt charged with unspoken feelings. Then Marcus's phone rang, breaking the spell. It was his mother, checking on him as she did every evening. "Ma, I'm fine," he chuckled into the phone. "Yes, I took my medicine. No, I haven't had dinner yet." He rolled his eyes at Sarah, making her giggle. After he hung up, Sarah realized it was past 8 p.m. "I should probably go," she said reluctantly. "Wait," Marcus called as she stood up. Would you like to have dinner with me sometime, like a proper date?" Sarah felt her heart race. She knew what people might say, her family, his family, their friends. A black woman dating a disabled man would raise eyebrows in their conservative community. But looking at Marcus's hopeful face, she realized she didn't care about any of that. "I'd love to," she answered. Marcus's face lit up with that beautiful smile she'd grown to adore. "How about Saturday? I know a great place that makes the best soul food in Atlanta." As Sarah drove home that evening, she couldn't stop smiling. She knew this could get complicated. Her mother would worry, and people would talk. But something in her heart told her Marcus was worth any challenge that might come their way. That night, both Sarah and Marcus lay awake in their beds, thinking about each other, both excited and nervous about what the future might hold. Neither knew that their lives were about to change in ways they could never have imagined. Would you like me to continue with part 3? Saturday evening arrived, and Sarah stood in front of her mirror, smoothing down her yellow sundress for the 10th time. Her stomach was filled with butterflies as she thought about her date with Marcus. She hadn't felt this nervous since her first day as a nurse. At exactly 6 p.m., her doorbell rang. When Sarah opened the door, she found Marcus looking handsome in a crisp blue shirt, his wheelchair polished and sporting a new design with elegant black and silver patterns. "Wow," Marcus breathed, looking at her with admiration. "You look beautiful, Sarah." Sarah blushed. Thank you. You clean up pretty nice yourself. Marcus had arranged for an accessible taxi to take them to Mama Rose's Soul Kitchen, a cozy restaurant in downtown Atlanta. As they entered, an elderly woman with kind eyes approached them. Marcus Thompson, where have you been hiding, child? The woman hugged him before turning to Sarah with a knowing smile. And who is this lovely young lady? Mama Rose, this is Sarah, Marcus said proudly. Sarah, meet Mama Rose. She's been feeding me since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. Mama Rose led them to a specially reserved table where Sarah could sit comfortably while Marcus could keep his wheelchair in place. The restaurant was warm and inviting, filled with the delicious smells of southern cooking and the soft sounds of jazz music. As they enjoyed their meal of fried chicken, collard greens, and sweet potato pie, Sarah and Marcus shared more about their lives. Marcus told her about the day of his accident, something he hadn't shared with many people. I was inspecting the upper floor of a construction site, he explained, pushing his food around his plate. I noticed some unsafe scaffolding and was rushing to get the workers down. That's when I slipped. The doctors said I was lucky to survive the fall. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed his hand. I'm glad you did. Marcus smiled, turning his hand to hold hers. You know what's strange? Sometimes I think that accident was a blessing in disguise. It taught me what really matters in life. Their conversation was interrupted by a loud voice from across the restaurant. Marcus? Marcus Thompson? A tall man approached their table, someone Marcus clearly recognized but didn't seem happy to see. Hey, James, Marcus said quietly. Man, I haven't seen you since, you know. James shifted uncomfortably, then noticed Sarah. His eyes widened slightly as he looked between them, clearly realizing they were on a date. An awkward silence fell over the table. Sarah could feel other diners starting to stare, some whispering among themselves. She knew what they were thinking. What was a healthy, young black woman doing on a date with a man in a wheelchair? But then Marcus did something that made Sarah's heart swell. He straightened in his chair, smiled confidently, and said, James, I'd like you to meet Sarah, my date. Sarah's a nurse practitioner at Atlanta Memorial, and she's one of the most amazing people I've ever met. The pride and certainty in his voice silenced any whispers. James mumbled a quick greeting and hurried away, but Sarah barely noticed. She was too busy falling a little bit in love with Marcus's courage and dignity. After dinner, they decided to take a short wheel/walk through the nearby park. The evening was warm, and fairy lights twinkled in the trees. They stopped near a fountain, where Marcus told jokes that made Sarah laugh until her sides hurt. Sarah, Marcus said suddenly, his voice serious, I need to be honest with you. I like you. A lot. But my life isn't easy. Being with me means dealing with a lot of challenges, a lot of stares, a lot of whispers. I wouldn't blame you if that's not what you want. Sarah looked at Marcus, seeing not his wheelchair but his kind eyes, his brave heart, and his beautiful soul. She knelt down beside his chair so they were at eye level. Marcus Thompson, she said firmly, I like you too. A lot. And I don't care what anyone else thinks or says. When I'm with you, I feel happy, I feel real, I feel complete. Marcus's eyes shone with emotion. Slowly, he leaned forward, and Sarah met him halfway. Their first kiss was soft and sweet, full of promise and possibility. As they pulled apart, both smiling, neither noticed the people walking past or the curious glances. In that moment, it was just the two of them, starting something beautiful and real. Would you like me to continue with part 4? 3 months into their relationship, Sarah and Marcus faced their biggest challenge yet, meeting each other's families. They decided to start with Sarah's parents, arranging a Sunday dinner at her family's home after church. Sarah stood nervously in her parents' driveway, watching Marcus navigate his wheelchair up the newly installed temporary ramp her father had put in place that morning. Her mother, Mrs. Jenkins, peeked through the curtains for the 5th time. Lord have mercy, Sarah heard her mother mutter as she opened the front door. Mr. Jenkins, tall and dignified in his Sunday best, stood beside his wife with an unreadable expression. Mama, Daddy, Sarah said, her voice stronger than she felt. This is Marcus Thompson. Marcus wheeled forward, extending his hand with a warm smile. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins. Sarah has told me so much about you both. Mrs. Jenkins shook his hand limply. while Mr. Jenkins gave a firm handshake, studying Marcus carefully. The silence that followed was deafening until Mrs. Jenkins remembered her southern hospitality. "Well, come on in. Dinner's ready," she said, leading them to the dining room. Sarah noticed her mother had already removed one of the dining chairs to make space for Marcus's wheelchair. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. During dinner, Marcus charmed them with stories about his business and his volunteer work with disabled children. Sarah watched as her father's stern expression gradually softened, especially when Marcus discussed his plans to expand his business. "So you're a business owner?" Mr. Jenkins asked, seeming impressed despite himself. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied. "Started it from my hospital bed. Now we're shipping wheelchair accessories nationwide." Mrs. Jenkins, however, couldn't hold back her concerns any longer. "But Sarah, baby," she interrupted, "have you really thought this through? Taking care of a disabled husband, it's a lot of responsibility." "Mrs. Jenkins," Marcus spoke before Sarah could respond, his voice gentle but firm. "I understand your concern, but I want you to know something. I don't need someone to take care of me. I need a partner to share my life with. Your daughter isn't my nurse. She's the woman I'm falling in love with." Sarah reached under the table and squeezed Marcus's hand, fighting back tears at his words. Her father cleared his throat, clearly moved. "More sweet potato pie, Marcus," Mr. Jenkins offered, his voice gruff with emotion. The following weekend, it was time to meet Marcus's family. His mother, a small woman named Rose Thompson, opened the door to her small but immaculate house. Unlike Sarah's parents, she greeted Sarah with a warm hug. "So you're the nurse who stole my baby's heart," she said, pulling Sarah inside. Marcus's siblings were all there, his older brothers James and Michael, his older sister Patricia, and his younger sister Lisa. They welcomed Sarah warmly, but she could sense their protective attitude toward Marcus. During dinner, Patricia pulled Sarah aside in the kitchen. "Listen," she said quietly, "Marcus is special. He's been through so much, but he never complains. If you're not serious about him—" "I am," Sarah interrupted firmly. "I love your brother, disability and all. He makes me laugh. He challenges me to be better, and he sees me for who I really am." Patricia studied her face for a moment before breaking into a smile. "Good answer," she said, hugging Sarah tightly. Later that evening, as Marcus's family shared embarrassing stories about his childhood, Sarah watched him laugh and joke with his siblings. His disability seemed to disappear in the warmth of family love and acceptance. On the drive home, Marcus was quiet. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked. "I heard what you said to Patricia," he admitted, "about loving me." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. She hadn't meant for him to hear that yet. "Well, it's true," she said softly. Marcus reached over and took her hand. "I love you too, Sarah Jenkins. More than I ever thought possible." As they drove through the quiet Atlanta streets, both families' concerns seemed to fade away. They knew there would be more challenges ahead, more stairs to ignore, more prejudices to overcome. But in that moment, their love felt stronger than any obstacle. What they didn't know was that the biggest test of their love was still to come, and it would arrive on what should have been the happiest day of their lives. Would you like me to continue with part 5? 1 year into their relationship, Marcus took Sarah to the park where they had shared their first kiss. The evening was perfect, stars twinkling above, a gentle breeze rustling through the trees, and the same fountain bubbling nearby. "Remember when I told you my accident taught me what really matters in life?" Marcus asked, his hands fidgeting with something in his pocket. Sarah nodded, smiling at the memory of their first date. "Well, you're what matters most to me now," Marcus continued. With surprisingly steady hands, he pulled out a small velvet box. "Sarah Jenkins, will you marry me?" The ring sparkled in the moonlight, a simple but elegant diamond that Marcus had saved for months to buy. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she knelt beside his wheelchair. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes." The news of their engagement spread quickly. While their families had grown to accept their relationship, the idea of marriage brought new concerns to the surface. "But who will support you?" Sarah's mother asked during a tense family dinner. "What about children? Have you thought about the future?" "Actually, Mrs. Jenkins," Marcus spoke up, "my business made 6 figures last year, and as for children, there are many ways to build a family. Mr. Jenkins surprised everyone by supporting them. If Sarah and Marcus love each other, that's all that matters, he declared, ending further discussion. Wedding planning brought its own challenges. They visited 5 venues before finding one that was fully wheelchair accessible. The traditional father-daughter dance would be modified so Mr. Jenkins could walk beside Sarah while she danced with Marcus in his wheelchair. But the biggest surprise came during a routine doctor's visit 3 months before the wedding. Marcus's doctor discovered he had regained slight sensation in his toes, something that hadn't happened in the 3 years since his accident. It's a very small change, the doctor cautioned. Don't get your hopes up too high. But Marcus was determined. Without telling Sarah, he started intensive physical therapy sessions. Every day after work, he pushed himself harder, trying to make his legs remember how to move. Sarah noticed he seemed more tired than usual, but Marcus blamed it on wedding preparations. He wanted to surprise her on their special day. 2 weeks before the wedding, Sarah sat in her mother's living room, surrounded by women from both families for her bridal shower. The atmosphere had changed dramatically from the early days of their engagement. Even her mother was excited now, showing off pictures of Sarah's wedding dress to anyone who would look. You know, Mrs. Thompson, Marcus's mother, said quietly to Sarah, I haven't seen my son this happy since before his accident. You've given him something precious, Hope. Sarah squeezed her future mother-in-law's hand. He's given me so much more, she replied. The night before their wedding, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, thinking about the surprise he had planned. His legs weren't fully functional. With the help of specialized braces and months of secret practice, he could stand for a short time. His physical therapist had warned him about the risks, but Marcus was determined. Sarah also lay awake in her childhood bedroom, thinking about their journey. She remembered their first meeting in the hospital, their first date at Mama Rose's, all the obstacles they'd overcome together. Tomorrow, they would start a new chapter. The wedding morning dawned bright and clear. The accessible church they'd chosen was decorated with white and purple flowers, their favorite colors. Guests filled the pews, some still whispering about the unusual couple, but mostly sharing in their joy. Marcus waited at the altar in his wheelchair, which had been decorated with the same flowers. His heart pounded as the wedding march began to play. The church doors opened, and Sarah appeared on her father's arm. She wore a beautiful white dress that seemed to float around her as she walked. Marcus felt tears in his eyes as he watched her approach. Mr. Jenkins kissed his daughter's cheek and placed her hand in Marcus's. Sarah's eyes shone with love as she looked at her soon-to-be husband. Neither of them knew that in just a few minutes during the wedding blessing, something would happen that would leave everyone in the church speechless. Marcus's surprise was about to change everything. Would you like me to continue with part 6? The wedding ceremony began beautifully. Vaster spoke about love that overcomes all obstacles, while Sarah and Marcus held hands, lost in each other's eyes. The church was filled with their friends and family, some still dabbing tears from their eyes after watching Sarah's touching walk down the aisle. Then came time for the wedding blessing. The pastor raised his hands over the couple and began to pray. Dear Heavenly Father, bless this union. Marcus squeezed Sarah's hand and gave a subtle nod to his best friend James, who stood ready behind his wheelchair. Sarah noticed something different in Marcus's eyes, a mixture of determination and excitement that she couldn't quite understand. As the pastor continued the blessing, Marcus whispered, Sarah, I have a surprise for you. Before Sarah could ask what he meant, James stepped forward and helped Marcus attach something to his legs, mechanical braces that had been hidden under his pants. The congregation began to murmur in confusion. What are you doing? Sarah whispered, her heart beating faster. Marcus took a deep breath. Remember how tired I've been lately? I wasn't just planning the wedding. I've been going to extra physical therapy sessions for months. Slowly, with James's help on one side and his brother Michael on the other, Marcus began to push himself up from his wheelchair. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth as she watched her groom gradually rise to his feet. The church fell completely silent. Mrs. Jenkins gripped her husband's arm tightly. Marcus's mother began to cry softly in the front row. Marcus stood shakily, supported by the braces and his brothers, but he was standing. He was almost at eye level with Sarah for the first time since they'd met. The doctors found some sensation in my toes, Marcus explained, his voice trembling with effort. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me hope. I wanted to stand beside you on our wedding day, even if just for a moment. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she looked at her brave groom. The pastor had stopped the blessing, watching in amazement like everyone else. "I may not be able to dance with you," Marcus continued, sweat beading on his forehead from the effort of standing, "but I wanted to look into your eyes when we said our vows." Sarah stepped closer to him, carefully supporting his arm. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered. "I wanted to show everyone that our love makes impossible things possible," Marcus replied, his legs trembling but his voice strong. "That when two people truly love each other, they can overcome anything." The pastor, wiping tears from his own eyes, resumed the blessing. As he spoke about strength, love, and miracles, there wasn't a dry eye in the church. Marcus managed to stand for the entire blessing, though Sarah could see how much effort it took. When it was time for their vows, his voice was clear and unwavering as he promised to love her forever. Sarah's voice shook with emotion as she said her vows, looking directly into Marcus's eyes instead of having to look down at him in his wheelchair. "I promise to love you, support you, and stand by you, just as you're standing here with me today." After they exchanged rings, the pastor pronounced them husband and wife. For their first kiss as a married couple, they didn't have to figure out the logistics of Sarah bending down to Marcus's level. They simply leaned in and met in the middle. The church erupted in applause and cheers. Even Sarah's mother, who had been so worried about their marriage, was standing and clapping through her tears. Carefully, with his brother's help, Marcus lowered himself back into his wheelchair. He was exhausted but beaming with joy. Sarah knelt beside his chair and kissed him again. "You amazing man," she whispered. "I love you so much." "I love you too," Marcus replied. "And Sarah? This is just the beginning. The doctors say with these braces and more therapy, I might be able to stand for longer periods. I might even take a few steps someday." As they turned to face their cheering friends and family, Sarah knew that Marcus was right. This was just the beginning of their miracle story. Their love had already accomplished the impossible, and she couldn't wait to see what other miracles lay ahead. Would you like me to continue with part 7? The wedding reception was held in the church's beautifully decorated hall. Everyone was still talking about Marcus's surprise, and the atmosphere was filled with joy and amazement. The caterers had set up everything to be accessible, with lower tables that Marcus could easily reach from his wheelchair. As the celebration began, Sarah and Marcus faced another special moment, their first dance as husband and wife. They had practiced this moment for weeks, figuring out how to make it work beautifully with Marcus in his wheelchair. The DJ announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. and Mrs. Thompson for their first dance." Sarah stood beside Marcus's wheelchair as At Last by Etta James began to play. They had chosen this song not just for its beautiful melody, but for its meaning. At last, their love had overcome all obstacles. Marcus took Sarah's hand and began to guide his wheelchair in a slow circle while Sarah danced gracefully beside him. They had choreographed every move, every turn, every moment. Sarah would spin out and then return to him, her white dress flowing around them both. Halfway through the song, Marcus surprised everyone again. With help from his brothers, he stood once more, this time using his braces and a special support bar they had secretly attached to his wheelchair. Sarah stepped into his arms, and though he couldn't move his feet, they swayed together to the music. Mrs. Jenkins leaned over to her husband and whispered, "Look at our baby girl. She's glowing with happiness." Mr. Jenkins nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat as he watched his daughter dance with her brave new husband. After the dance, Marcus's doctor, who had been invited to the wedding, came to congratulate them. "What you did today was remarkable," he said to Marcus, "but remember to take it slowly. Rome wasn't built in a day." "Don't worry, Doc," Sarah said with a smile. "I'll make sure he doesn't overdo it." During dinner, James, Marcus's best man, stood up to give his speech. "When Marcus had his accident," he began, "he told me from his hospital bed that he would never let it stop him from living his best life. I didn't fully believe him then, but watching him today, seeing the love between him and Sarah, I realize he was right. Marcus, my brother, you've shown us all what true strength looks like." Sarah's maid of honor, her cousin Rachel, spoke next. "When Sarah first told me she was dating a man in a wheelchair, I worried about her. I thought she was making her life harder than it needed to be. Then I saw them together, and I understood. Love isn't about making life easier. It's about making life fuller, richer, more meaningful. Sarah and Marcus, you two have the kind of love stories are written about. As the evening went on, Marcus and Sarah greeted their guests, accepted congratulations, and shared quiet moments together. During a peaceful moment, Marcus turned to his new wife. "You know what's funny?" he said. "Everyone keeps talking about my surprise, about me standing up. But the real miracle isn't that I can stand sometimes. The real miracle is finding someone who loves me whether I'm standing or sitting." Sarah leaned down and kissed him softly. "The real miracle," she corrected, "is finding someone whose soul stands so tall that it makes everything else seem small in comparison." Later, as they prepared to leave for their honeymoon, Marcus's mother pulled Sarah aside. "Thank you," she said simply, hugging her new daughter-in-law. "You've given my son wings." Sarah hugged her back. "He's the one who taught me how to fly," she replied. As they left the reception in their decorated, accessible van, with cans rattling behind them and their loved ones cheering, Sarah and Marcus knew that their story was far from over. Marcus had more physical therapy ahead, more challenges to face, but they would face them together. What they didn't know was that life had one more beautiful surprise in store for them, one that would make their happiness even more complete. But that would come later, in its own perfect time. Would you like me to continue with the final part 8? 1 year after their magical wedding, Sarah and Marcus sat in their doctor's office, holding hands tightly as they received unexpected but wonderful news. "Congratulations," Dr. Anderson smiled warmly. "You're pregnant, Sarah." Marcus's eyes filled with tears of joy. After his accident, doctors had told him having children might be difficult, but not impossible. They had been trying for several months, hoping but afraid to hope too much. "We're going to be parents," Sarah whispered, squeezing Marcus's hand. Later that evening, they gathered both families at their accessible home, a beautiful ranch-style house they had bought 6 months after their wedding. The house had been modified to make everything easier for Marcus, who could now stand for longer periods with his braces and even take a few steps with support. "Everyone," Marcus announced, beaming with pride, "we're having a baby." The room erupted in celebration. Mrs. Jenkins, who had once worried about her daughter's future, was now dancing around the room in joy. Marcus's mother hugged Sarah gently, already treating her more carefully now that she was carrying her grandchild. "But how will you manage?" someone asked, voicing the concern that others might have been thinking. Marcus wheeled over to Sarah and stood up using his braces, something he could now do for several minutes at a time. "The same way we manage everything else," he said confidently. "Together." The pregnancy months flew by. Marcus threw himself into preparing for the baby, designing a special crib that he could access from his wheelchair. He had become somewhat of a celebrity in the disability community, giving speeches about never giving up on dreams. His wheelchair accessory business had expanded to include adaptive baby products, inspired by his own upcoming journey into parenthood. Sarah continued working at the hospital until her 8th month, where she had become an inspiration to both patients and staff. Many people who had seen their wedding video or heard their story would stop her in the halls to tell her how their love story had given them hope. On a warm spring morning, Sarah went into labor. Marcus wheeled anxiously beside her hospital bed, holding her hand through every contraction. Using his braces, he stood beside her during the final pushes, supporting her as she brought their child into the world. "It's a girl," the doctor announced. They named her Hope Rose Thompson, hope for the thing that had carried them through all their challenges, and rose after both their mothers. When Marcus first held his daughter, sitting safely in his wheelchair, he couldn't stop the tears from flowing. "She's perfect," he whispered. Just like her daddy, Sarah smiled tiredly from her bed. The news of Hope's birth spread quickly through the hospital. Many remembered the nurse who had fallen in love with her patient and their incredible wedding day miracle. Now they had a new miracle to celebrate. As the years passed, Hope grew into a beautiful little girl who saw nothing strange about having a daddy in a wheelchair. To her, it was normal to see her father using braces to stand during special moments, or watching him wheel through their house chasing her in games of tag. Marcus continued his physical therapy, making slow but steady progress. By Hope's 5th birthday, he could walk short distances with a walker, though he still used his wheelchair most of the time. One day, when Hope was drawing a family picture in kindergarten, her teacher noticed she had drawn her father both sitting and standing. Why did you draw your daddy twice? The teacher asked. Because my daddy can do both, Hope answered proudly. He says love makes impossible things possible. Sarah and Marcus kept that picture framed in their living room, a reminder of their journey. Their love story became known throughout Atlanta and beyond, inspiring other couples facing similar challenges. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Marcus and Sarah returned to the church where they had married. Using his walker, with Sarah by his side and 5-year-old Hope holding his hand, Marcus walked slowly down the same aisle where he had once surprised everyone by standing. Look how far we've come, Sarah said softly. Marcus smiled at his wife and daughter. And this is still just the beginning. Their story taught everyone who knew them that true love knows no boundaries, that miracles happen every day, and that sometimes the biggest blessings come in ways we least expect. The end.